Welcome everyone to our panel that is doing double duty today as part of Presidential Symposium Week and also Constitution Day. I'm Jenny Roberts, I'm the Dean of the Law School. And I want to welcome a few people. Welcome to everyone, first of all. But welcome to our Provost, Charlie Riordan, to some members of the Cabinet who are here. Thank you for coming. And of course to our law school faculty and administrators who have joined students from the law school, and I think some undergraduate students as well. It's just great to have you here in the law school. So the 2025 Hofstra University Presidential Symposium has the theme of, quote, the beauty of, ... end quote. And it invited faculty to explore and share the beauty they find in their fields of study and teaching. Faculty were asked to consider and discuss the beauty that first drew them into those fields and that continues to inspire their work and that animates the questions they ask and the knowledge that they seek. That seemed like a perfect fit and also a necessary one because we couldn't have two major events in 1 week to combine the symposium with Constitution Day, which always falls on September 17th. There's actually a federal law requiring all educational institutions receiving federal funds to provide an educational program on this day. But more importantly, Constitution Day, which is officially Constitution and Citizenship Day, commemorates the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17th, 1787. So I went back to my remarks at this event last year, and I want to repeat two things that I said there that to me seemed even more important to stress today. First, I noted how 237 years ago, now 238 years ago, that number of years had passed since our founding fathers committed, however imperfectly, to the idea that the people and the rule of law, not God or king, would form the foundation of our government. That was the commitment. Second, last year I shared the words of the late Justice Thurgood Marshall, namely that the Constitution was, as he said, defective from the start because the framers left out a majority of Americans when they wrote the phrase, "we the people." As Marshall also noted, although some Constitutional Convention participants voiced eloquent objections to slavery, in the end they, almost half of whom were slave owners, quote, consented to a document which laid a foundation for the tragic events which were to follow. Last year we explored through the lens of the Korematsu case how tragic interpretations of the Constitution have also followed. And finally, last year, I ended by saying this about the Constitution. What a radical and inspirational document it was at the time, how ambitious its vision was, how much faith it put in people to know what they want and to work together to get it done, how surprisingly enduring the government it created has proven to be. 1 year later, the question posed to this panel sounds a very different tone. The question posed is, do we need a new, more beautiful Constitution? Our panelists are going to discuss a radical, inspirational, and perhaps somewhat unsettling idea, which is whether America needs a dramatic constitutional overhaul. That is not a question, of course, that arose only in the past year, but it has certainly taken on more urgency in the past year. This question about a new Constitution builds on the work of scholars who posit that the Constitution stands in the path of American democracy and in fact may even be a threat to American democracy. The question comes at an important moment when we need to search for beauty in change and hope for the future. The panelists, through their various topics, will consider whether wholesale constitutional reform is needed as the path forward for a stronger American political system. And so with that, I'm going to introduce the outstanding group of scholars that we have here today with us. Professor Eric Friedman is the Siggy B. Wilzig Distinguished Professor of Constitutional Rights here at the Law School. He has incredible breadth and depth in his career, so I'm just going to note that one of his main areas of research includes constitutional law and history, with a special emphasis on the history of the Revolutionary period, First Amendment topics, and separation of powers, including remedies for presidential misconduct. Professor Friedman has testified on these matters before Congress and other legislative bodies. He's a prolific scholar, and he's regularly quoted in the media. Dr. Mina Bose is Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs in the Peter S. Calico School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs, and Director of the Peter S. Calico Center for the Study of the American Presidency here at Hofstra University. She's also the Peter S. Calico Chair in Presidential Studies and a Professor of Political Science. Dr. Bose has written and edited books and textbooks on the presidency and presidential policy. She serves on the editorial board of Political Science Quarterly and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Julian Koo is the Maurice A. Deane Distinguished Professor of Constitutional Law here at the Law School and the Faculty Director of International Programs. He's also the organizer of this panel, and I think a few of you here might know him a little bit from class. Professor Koo writes about the relationship of international and constitutional law and has co-authored a book and written many articles in his field. He co-founded Opinio Juris, a leading international law blog, and he's regularly quoted in the media. He gives academic lectures and workshops in the US, Europe, and Asia. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Friedman, our first. Oh, you're ready first? With that, I will turn it over to Professor Koo, our first panelist. Oh, never mind.
That's okay. No, that's okay. Okay, welcome, and especially welcome to those of you who are students of mine who we had class just this morning at 8 a.m. Some of you may be wondering why we're still here. It's 6:30 p.m., but trust me, we'll hopefully make it worth your time. Let me just say a few words, introduce the idea for this panel, set the stage for my fellow panelists' discussion. As many of my students, as I always emphasize in my own constitutional law classes, Americans revere the Constitution. As I always tell my students in Constitutional Law 1, there are very few countries which have built a literal temple to house their founding constitutional documents. But the National Archives Museum in Washington, D.C., which displays originals of the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Declaration of Independence, averages about 1 million visitors a year. And granted, the Natural History Museum gets 4.4 million visitors a year, but 1 million is not too shabby when you think about all it really is two very old pieces of paper, and that are about 238 years old. But this museum probably would rank in the top 10 sites in visiting Washington, D.C. And so I think that people, as I always say, it's not uncommon for our leaders to carry a copy of the Constitution, pull it out and wave it, and say, this is where all the truth of our government and our politics lies. Yet in recent years, as Deane Roberts mentioned, there's been a very discernible shift in popular and scholarly discourse that we don't need just a better interpretation of the Constitution, but wholesale constitutional reform to change and amend the Constitution. And even more than that, the Constitution itself is the problem. I would just cite one book by Professor Erwin Chemerinsky, a leading scholar of constitutional law and the dean of the UC Berkeley Law School, who last year published a book called No Democracy Lasts Forever, How the Constitution Threatens the United States of America. Deane Chemerinsky has been writing about constitutional law for 40 years. He teaches constitutional law. I would dare say he loves constitutional law. It's like someone who studied the Michelangelo Sistine Chapel for like 40 years, and at the end of the 40 years said, this thing's terrible. Tear it up. Tear the thing down. That's essentially where we are with Deane Chemerinsky with his book last year. More intriguingly, he actually argues if we don't completely start over and have a new constitution, we might be facing civil war and secession. So this is not like a small thing to argue. Relatedly, progressive intellectual Osita Nwanevu recently published the book, The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding. He argues that the left, as broadly defined, cannot succeed in its policy agenda without changing the Constitution in dramatic ways. The idea that we need to give up on the current Constitution is mostly coming from the left these days, but it's not always so. Conservatives have long argued for term limits on members of Congress, a balanced budget amendment, a ban on flag desecration, and other serious changes to the constitutional order. Over 15,000 amendments have been proposed since 1791, although only 15 have been approved in the last 230 years. So this moment seems different. There's serious concern about all three branches of government. Congress is accused of being deadlocked, ineffective, because of the Senate structure, or maybe other features like the filibuster. Maybe it's flooded, it's accused of being flooded with campaign money from shady, undisclosed sources. And it has not balanced the budget for the lifetime of every student here, pretty much. Okay. The president is accused of being too powerful and without any checks on his actions or any liability for bad or misbehavior, and with too much power over domestic and international war powers, and also being selected through an undemocratic Electoral College. And finally, the Supreme Court of the United States has long been accused of being out of touch with democratic values, and in recent years accused of being ethically compromised. So not everyone agrees with these critiques. I myself don't agree with all of these critiques. But we'll see that there is a certain amount of public support for change of certain parts of the Constitution, or perhaps in the more radical spheres of our politics, just starting over with a new Constitution. And so I know this, I've been telling students who've been suffering through my lectures the last few weeks, that we are learning constitutional law as lawyers, but we also need to think about the Constitution from a broader perspective. And sometimes you need to think about it, dare I say, like a political scientist. How would you design or change the Constitution if you have the ability to change or reform it? That might help us understand what the Constitution is and what's good and bad about it. So tonight is an opportunity to think about whether these critiques, some of these very, very strong critiques of the Constitution, are fair. And if they are, where would it make sense to amend the Constitution? This is not a question for members of the Supreme Court. This is a question for every American citizen. And for my students here in particular, which a lot of you are my students, and I would like you to think very hard about where the Constitution could or should be amended and why. And there might be some sort of assignment coming in your future which asks you to deal with this question. And for the rest of you, I would ask you to consider these ideas seriously, and before the end of this evening, be ready to vote your preference. We will ask the audience to vote on their preferred constitutional change, or not at all, at the end of this session. So I look forward to our discussion, and I turn it over now to my colleague, soon to be former colleague, but my colleague, Eric Friedman, who's been a great mentor to me as a scholar of constitutional law. So I'm really glad to introduce and have him speak to us today. Thank you, Professor Friedman.
Okay, this is fun. He sets all these vast questions, and she says, hold it to 10 minutes. So, the actual more narrow agenda, as my assignment, is what would be some reasonably sensible paths to reform of Congress. Professor Bose will be discussing the presidency. Professor Koo will be discussing the Supreme Court. So I'm talking about Congress, and fortunately I don't have to spend a lot of my 10 minutes showing you the existence of the problem. You have a Congress in which there is essentially none of the horse trading to create varying coalitions to put together packages. Everyone votes the party line. And the party line is more extreme in both parties than the position of the average voter, because the districts are overwhelmingly drawn to favor one party or the other, and therefore the only thing a member of the House has to worry about is the party primary. On best estimate, last cycle, no more than 15% of the districts in the country were competitive, and it'll be less now with the gerrymandering going forward by both parties. And therefore, large numbers of voters in the country reasonably believe that their congressperson on average doesn't vote the way they would vote, and that they have no realistic opportunity to fix it. All right, so, as I said, the problem's easy to state, a little more difficult to solve, because after all, if you have a state with 60% Republicans and 40% Democrats who are evenly spread out throughout the state, and every district is fairly drawn to reflect that, then the Republicans win every single seat, and the 40% of Democrats in the state don't have their voice heard. And that statement of the problem contains a whole lot of assumptions, right? It assumes an even geographic spread. It assumes two parties and ignores how the candidates of those parties are chosen. It assumes single-member districts, and of course it assumes fairly drawn. Every one of those assumptions needs some re-examination. And at the end, you need to figure out what your ultimate goal is in making your reforms. It could be that your ultimate goal is simply to get to a statewide percentage of Republican and Democratic members of the House reflecting their percentage in the population. Or it could be that your goal is to have the median representative in the congressional delegation of whatever party align more closely with the views of the median voter in the state, whether that's a moderate Republican or a moderate Democrat, with the aim of having them get to Washington and work across the aisle with similarly minded people and get federal legislation which reflects more or less what the country wants. Or it could be, more ambitiously, that you want to have more than two parties so that people can find one closer to their package of views. Today, there are any number of people who think that at the end of the day, if I have to pick one, I'll go with the Republicans or I'll go with the Democrats, but it really isn't quite right. After all, there are any number of moderate or centrist Republicans who are not comfortable with where the party is, and lots of working class Democrats who are not comfortable with where the party is. There's no reason you couldn't have more than two parties to reflect those varying packages of views. But it's time to turn to some practicalities. Because even if you have an ideal outcome, every path from here to there has to contend with practicalities. And some have to do with legal matters, because some reforms require constitutional change and some require statutory change. But all of them have to deal with the problem of dealing with a very powerful set of incumbent forces who like the existing system just fine and can be counted on to fight basic reforms. And some of you, I guess I was going to say may recall, I don't think may recall is right, will eventually learn about this issue being at the center of Baker versus Carr way back in 1962. And after that, the forces of incumbency made it a very heavy lift to get the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, which was a triumph of moderate coalition building, giving tribute to the legislative genius of Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, who pulled together that act. And once it did pass, organizations advocating for minority racial groups consistently teamed up with the Republican Party in a way to get maps that elected representatives with more extreme views rather than more centrist views, as we're going to see in a minute. So, the strength of my idea for reform is that it's reasonably achievable, and the structural reason is that it works from the ground up and seeks to make progress by encouraging people to work on their state legislatures, which in many historical circumstances has been the best path for reformists to follow. And my idea goes like this. Remember that constitutional amendments do not have to originate with Congress. Under Article 5 of the Constitution, when 2/3 of the state legislatures call for a convention to consider a proposed amendment, it has to happen. Therefore, the plan is for concerned citizens in every state to make this an issue in each and every state legislative race. If elected, will you support a call for a constitutional amendment to require that congressional districts be compact, contiguous, and of reasonably equal population? And because state legislative districts are much smaller and more numerous than congressional ones, it's perfectly plausible to think one could achieve legislative majorities for this, especially in states that are fairly evenly divided between parties like North Carolina, but seeing big swings in congressional representation every time another party controls the state legislature. And one of the advantages of going this route is that in supporting this amendment, legislatures would know they're not committing to unilateral disarmament. They are bound by it only if every other state is bound by it because it's a constitutional amendment. And my idea is that long before the necessary number of state legislatures sign on to the call for a convention, the politicians will see which way the wind is blowing and respond accordingly. Because the truth is that what I'm suggesting can be done by federal statute. It just won't be until there's some pressure to make it happen. Meanwhile, reformers should not be sitting idly by. Districts that are compact, contiguous, and of reasonably equal population will put an end to lots of imaginatively shaped districts that gave gerrymandering its name, which is a key step, but that will not itself solve the extremism problem. Thank you, Deane. You are all now viewing the slide which I have imaginatively entitled The Blog. We're now solving the extremism problem. Okay? And it's achievable by state law, and some states have done it. You need to have lines drawn by a permanent, independent, nonpartisan commission for this reason. Let us assume that you have a state where a third of the voters are members of minority groups or a minority group, and that state is going to have 3 districts. Well, I can draw you 2 different maps that are compact, contiguous, and have equal population. Right? In the first one, the center district obviously is highly likely to elect a member who is a member of a minority group and who is highly likely to be a Democrat. And in the other 2, the opposite person is highly likely to be a white person and a Republican. And consistently, the minority groups have teamed up with the Republican Party to favor those maps whenever there's any legal discussion. But it doesn't have to be that way, as you see in the second map, which equally meets my criteria. The minority group has 1/3 of each district, which means that they are a heavily influential bloc whose interests will have to be attended to, but the member may not be a member of that minority group, and I don't know whether it's going to be a Republican or a Democrat, but it will certainly be someone who is relatively moderate by the standards of both of those parties, because that's an important voting bloc you need to take into account. And for many, many years, political scientists have been arguing quite futilely in terms of the real world, but have been arguing that that second map would actually produce outcomes more desirable to minority groups, of course, that's just simple arithmetic. Under the first one, you're gaining one and losing two. Right? In any event, the incumbents aren't going to go for option one, but an independent, non-partisan, I didn't say bipartisan because the existing groups will just divvy up the goodies, non-partisan commission can do this. Arizona and Iowa have it, and the same computers that make gerrymandering so effective can do the opposite. And if you want the details, you can see Justice Kagan's opinion in the Rucho case, Rucho versus Common Clause 580 U.S. 684 from 2019. A computer can draw districts that are designed in such a way as to result in a congressional delegation that will more closely match the policy preferences of the state. But eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Sometimes politicians running for re-election promise to support nonpartisan commissions and break their promises, either the promise to create the commission or the promise to abide by the results. In New York and California, they've got commissions from there, keep overriding results. All right, those politicians have to be punished at the polls, and the timing of state legislative elections makes that possible. Redistricting traditionally happens every 10 years, even if that's down to 5 now. The legislative elections happen every 2 years. So politicians who break promises can be punished in time to fix the problem. And besides, with the constitutional amendment or statute that I already described, in effect, there's going to be a lot less incentive to break the promise. California is planning to override its commission in retaliation for what Texas is doing. But under my system, Texas, under my system, Texas wouldn't be able to do what it's doing. This is the latest map just approved by the Texas legislature, and I think it's a fair and non-political comment to say that those districts are not compact and contiguous, right? Okay, so Texas wouldn't be able to do that, and therefore one hopes, therefore California's nonpartisan map would stay in place, and one hopes that the momentum would be in favor of a virtuous circle rather than a downward spiral. And that is my idea.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here because it strikes me as our conversation has begun and listening to this presentation for how we could change Congress, that while tearing down the Constitution and building a new one is a possibility, as was suggested at the start of this event, a lot of changes can be made within the current structure of our Constitution. And that can be either through constitutional amendment or by actions of Congress or the state legislatures. And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about today. I have been teaching about the American presidency this is my 30th year of teaching. And when I started in fall of '96 at Hofstra, it was a presidential election year, we probably spent maybe 20 minutes or so on the Electoral College. I have colleagues who teach elections, maybe they spent a class on it. But the traditional thinking of the Electoral College was an archaic institution. The framers put this into place. No other country has it. It reinforces the popular vote. And so let me just jump from 1996 to 2024, and then we'll go back to 2000 and 2016. If you look at the Electoral College map that we have today, this one, there have been actually very few changes since the Constitution was signed in 1787. The 12th Amendment in 1804 required electors to vote for president and vice president separately. This is after John Adams had Thomas Jefferson as his vice president. That was not a very easy cooperative relationship per se. So it and then in 1800 the election was decided at the House, and they decided on separate elections for the president and vice president. The only other major constitutional change for the Electoral College is the 23rd Amendment. 3 votes to the District of Columbia, which does not have voting representation in Congress. So by and large, the Electoral College, since George Washington's election, which was actually 1789 and was inaugurated, well, it took a little while in the 18th century. It was inaugurated on April 30th in New York City, actually. The main change with the Electoral College has been the allocation of votes per state. So this is the 2024 map. Look at it wherever you want. It's based on the 2020 census. Some points to note: Texas gained 2 seats. Colorado got 1, Florida got 1, Montana got 1, North Carolina got 1, Oregon got 1. California lost 1, Illinois lost 1, Michigan lost 1, just kind of some of the examples there that I'm giving you. So you see changes based on population. Each state gets a minimum of 3 electoral college votes. But by and large, right, the structure, the 538, does not change unless we add more votes. Right? Because currently it's the 50 states and Washington, D.C. So that's relatively stable. If you look at 2020, there were some other changes here. Pennsylvania had 1 more. That was based on the 2010 census. And again, we see 2020 was the election, of course, the pandemic election. Voter turnout was 158 million. It was close to 60, well, depending how you calculate voter turnout, 63% of the voting age population or 65% of the voting eligible. And I can talk about that if you want. But the point being, voter turnout was the highest that it had been since the early 20th century, since 1908. In our recent elections, 2024 and 2020, the results were clear on election night or a few days later, even if they were challenged. This is just last November, right? Donald Trump, of course, becoming only the 2nd president to win non-consecutive elections. The first was Grover Cleveland in 1884 and 1892. But Trump comes just short of a majority of the popular vote, but wins decisively in the Electoral College, better than he did in 2016, where he had 306 on election night, but there were some famous electors. And voter turnout in 2024 was very strong as well. Not as high as 2020, but it was about 63% of the voting eligible population, so about 2 points less. Right? If you look at the 2020 election, you see that Joe Biden actually was the mirror flip of 2016. Biden won 306 votes, and Trump lost. Now, what's interesting is, in 2020, had 4 states shifted. Actually, had 3 states shifted: Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. If the votes had been for Donald Trump instead of Joe Biden, it would have been 269 to 269. And if you add in Nevada, that shifts the margin, and it would have been a Trump victory. That total would have been Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. That was about 42,000, roughly, right, 44,000 votes that made that difference. So a mandate or a decisive victory in the Electoral College doesn't necessarily mean a decisive victory in the popular vote. But still, when they line up, there's not a problem. So then we get to the problems, right? In 2000, for the first time since 1888, the candidate who won the election, George W. Bush, lost the popular vote. This came down to, I think it was 537 votes in Florida. Hotly contested this election. The Supreme Court intervened, went on for some 36 days. It was in the middle of December. Supreme Court ruled in Bush v. Gore. And I believe it was about, Al Gore actually won about 500,000 more votes nationally. So that sparked proposals for changing the Electoral College. But 2004, George W. Bush won a solid majority of the popular vote and won the Electoral College vote. I think it was 286 against John Kerry. So there were really no, the kind of movement for the popular vote didn't disappear, but kind of lost some steam, I think it's fair to say. 2008, 2012, Barack Obama won both of those very clearly, actually fewer popular votes in 2012, but still won clearly. And then you have 2016, right, where Donald Trump won 306 Electoral College votes, Hillary Clinton won 232. And the three blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, it was a total of about 78,000 votes that made the difference. So this brings us to a question. If we've had two earthquake elections, if you will, right, in the 21st century, let's count 2000 there, then is it time, do we need to change the way we select the president? Well, I want to talk about the reforms for a few minutes. I'm just going to very quickly go through kind of the standard political science arguments we make. There are reasons to keep it. One is structural. With single-member districts and winner-take-all, we don't have proportional representation in Congress. We don't have runoff elections. Our system is structured to have a two-party system. And the Electoral College, by and large, reinforces that. Typically, with some exceptions, 1888, 2000, 2016 being clear examples. I can go to some earlier cases, 1800 and 1824 when the House decided, and then 1826 when there was a special commission. But over the course of history, so that's, I've just kind of quickly talked about 6 examples right there. But over the course of American history, by and large, the Electoral College has reinforced the popular vote. Federalism. The Constitution was a negotiation between the national government and the states. In fact, the debates at the Constitutional Convention were to have either Congress elect the president or a direct popular vote. And they did this indirectly through having the states pick electors who would then in turn pick the president. And really, while George Washington was expected to win, framers had no idea what would happen in 1792, and then in 1796 when George Washington said he wouldn't run for a third term. It forces attention to small and large states, and it requires candidates to have some complexity. You'll see complexity will come up. Why get rid of it? Democracy, nature, rule by the people, right? Unfair small state advantage. I put illegitimacy in with a question mark because that's obviously hotly contested. But if you win with the Electoral College vote and you lose the popular vote, are you a legitimate president, right? That's the question. And it's very difficult to understand, right? It takes a lot of time to explain it. So, very quickly, I think I'm already out of my time, so I'm going to just say, political scientist Stephen Wayne has published this kind of Bible of presidential elections, The Road to the White House. And he discusses, and many scholars have, 4 proposals, right? The easiest one, get rid of faithless electors and have an automatic electoral college. Kind of like what we do to get rid of gerrymandering, right? Just remove the possibility. And if you think, well, what are the odds of that? In 2000, George W. Bush won with 271 electoral college votes. He would have been fine with 270. 269, it would have gone to the House. 268, Al Gore would have won. So this is not an abstract issue. Maine and Nebraska, 2 states that have a district model of selecting electors. So 2 electors are awarded to the candidate who wins the statewide vote. The others are based on who wins in the district. Another option is to allocate electors in proportion to each candidate's share of the popular vote. You could say that that's pretty much a popular vote, except if no one has a majority, the 270, then it would go to the House of Representatives. So then that's why some people say, get rid of the Electoral College entirely, either through constitutional amendment or adopt a national popular vote plan, which I don't have time to talk about, but it essentially calls for the states to agree to award their electors to whoever wins the national popular vote. And under the Constitution, that could be done without constitutional amendment. Very quickly, and this is from Professor Wayne's book, how would things change under the district plan in 1960? Kennedy would have lost to Nixon. Neither one would have gotten to 270. Actually it would have been, it was before DC, so it was 535. But nevertheless, they wouldn't have gotten to the majority. No change in 64, no change in 84. 1992, Bill Clinton. It was a three-way race. Ross Perot had 90% of the popular vote. No Electoral College votes. Under the proportional plan, it would have gone to the House. Under the district plan, Clinton's majority would have weakened. And in 2016, under the district plan, Trump still would have won, albeit a smaller majority. And there we say 304 because of the faithless electors. But under the proportional plan, narrowly would have gone to the Electoral College. In 2020, Biden wins with any of these options, but it is the smallest possibility with the proportional plan. And to bring us up to the present, in 2024, the proportional one, I didn't have good decisive data on that, so I just left it with the district plan. Trump would have won with a smaller majority. What does this all tell us? That if you change the system, we are going to have smaller margins, possibly more elections going to the House, or we have to consider whether we want runoff elections with a popular vote. Each one has its consequences, and I would say I'm not actually telling you to vote for any one of them, but I think they're ones we all need to consider. And I included the link to the national popular vote. I'm sure you can see this, get the slides if you want. This needs 61 more electoral votes from states to enact the national popular vote plan. And so it leaves us with the question, what's the most democratic and most constitutional approach to presidential selection in the 21st century? And we can do it without a major constitutional change if there's popular will and cooperation from the states. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm here to round out the Article 1 Congress, Article 2 Presidency, and I'm going to talk about Article 3, the lawyer's favorite branch of government, which is the federal courts, and particularly the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, so I'm going to talk about an idea that let me just say by noting that even though I offered a rather robust presentation to explain the arguments people are making for wholesale constitutional change, we need to really change things. I myself am generally suspicious of big changes like wholesale constitutional change. And temperamentally, I'm pretty conservative. I don't like it when they change the iOS on your phone. It's really annoying. I like old Coke. I'm not ordinarily a big change guy. But I also believe the U.S. Constitution is not beyond reproach. And I do worry that there's too much veneration of the Constitution as some sort of sacred document, and that I do believe that there are areas where there is widespread agreement that change would be beneficial. And there's no reason to think that certain changes would actually undermine the rest of the Constitution. And so that's why I'm going to sort of present one thing I do think can be changed that would actually benefit both the functioning of the Constitution and maybe stave off that Civil War Professor Chemerinsky is worried about. Okay, so let's start with the idea, which I'm going to talk about, the idea of imposing term limits on the members of the U.S. Supreme Court. Currently, the interpretation of the Constitution is that members of the federal courts and the Supreme Court serve on good behavior, which is interpreted as they have a life term and can't be removed except by impeachment. So this is sort of the lifetime appointment. And this is what, is there anything better than being a federal judge with a lifetime appointment? The only thing maybe is being tenured at a university, but maybe not, I don't know, it's a tough call. But lifetime appointments, at least for judges, but of course not for professors, can be problematic. And one of the things that people do argue about is that, and we've observed that Supreme Court nominations are increasingly politicized, hotly political, hotly contested, hotly divisive. That's one thing people have said that is related to lifetime appointments. The other concern is that some justices serve 30, some have served 40 years. And this seems like an outsized influence for just 1 or 2 people, or maybe 9 people. And finally, one of the most sort of strong critiques that people, especially Democrats, have recently noticed, randomized turnover, meaning that there's no sort of schedule for when changes occur in the Supreme Court, sometimes misaligns with the Democratic cycle. So you might get one president, like President Jimmy Carter, who got no appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court, or one president like President Joseph Biden, who got 1 appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court, and one president like President Donald Trump who had 3 appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that wasn't because there was any plan, but just because of the way things worked out, and that seemed to be misaligned with the democratic process. The other argument is that over time, historically, today, U.S. Supreme Court justices serve longer on average than they used to. This is an old graphic from the New York Times when Justice Kennedy was still on the bench back in 2017 or 2018 maybe. But the rough thing here just to point out is that the average tenure at that time of a U.S. Supreme Court justice was between 1975 and 1999, an average justice served 26 years. Whereas if you look in 1950, 1974, 18 years, and you go back to 1900 to 1924, an average justice only served 13 years. And this has many factors having to do with this, but one is that people have noticed that, generally speaking, today, people live longer than they did in 1900. Not much longer, but that's part of the reason why. Part of it is maybe like people consider it to be a more important job or such. But whatever it is, things have changed, and justices do serve longer on average than they have historically in recent years. Okay. And this argument is not as persuasive for a lot of people, but it is interesting. The United States is a pretty big outlier compared to other countries. So most countries have either term limits, meaning they can only serve a certain number of years on the highest court, or mandatory retirement at certain ages. So you hit 70 or something, or 75, and then you have to retire. Either way, what the result is that the average high court judge on many countries is the term is much lower. So you look at France, it's 9 years, that's a term. And the United States, this number is a little bit more recently, 28 years. So the average Supreme Court justice is serving in the United States roughly 28 years. The next closest is Norway, where they serve an average of 15 years. And so that makes the United States an outlier, which is okay. I mean, America is America. We are different. But it does suggest that there's something that the burden maybe has to explain why the system is this way. So here's a proposal. I'm not making this one up. This is actually a proposal that was proposed by 2 senators, Senator Welch of Vermont and Senator Manchin, who's now retired, from West Virginia, in the last Congress. And they proposed an amendment to the Constitution which would impose 18 non-renewable terms, fixed terms for each Supreme Court justice, and would schedule it so that every president would get at least 2 appointments during their 4 years as president, their 4-year term president. So every 4 years, there would be 2 vacancies that opened up on the court. And then there's a plan for phasing out the current justices who would basically get to serve out the life term, but once they were life term, they would then be put on this 18-year schedule, right? So this is a plan that's going to take a while, but one of the nice things about this idea is that there's no obvious benefits to one side or the other because it's such a long time scale, right? We don't know how things will be 18 years from now. We don't even know how things will be 18 months from now. And so, this is a good way as well as we roll this down, but I think everyone kind of agrees this might be something worth doing over the long term. Okay, so, and there's a lot of support. So here are comments from people who currently serve on the Supreme Court. Justice Kagan, a current serving member, I pulled this from a website called Fix the Court, which is very much like they want to change, this is what they want, but I think this quote is accurate. That this is, and her idea is that in 18 years, that's a long time, there's nothing, this seems like a good idea, and one of the things she thinks might be beneficial is that, and I think this is definitely a strong argument, is that it would take some of the pressure off each appointment. So it's not like it's the end of the world if this justice gets confirmed, because you know you'll have another one next year. Right? So it's not going to be like, we just don't know when the next justice will retire or pass away, and so this takes some of the pressure off of each individual. Justice Samuel Alito, who has not agreed with Justice Kagan on anything else in the last 5 years, but during his confirmation hearings, said that when he thinks that, I think a long term of years was probably not a bad idea, right? We want it to be long. He's a little bit, he's not a little bit softer on this, but he's like, I'm not open to the idea of a long term. Justice Breyer, who recently retired, he said, you know what, this is 18 years, I like 18 years, then I don't have to stress about when I'm going to retire. And if somebody may know, Justice Breyer, people were all over him, like, you must retire now before you accidentally die in office, and it became annoying to him. He's doing fine, his health is great, he could have served longer, but people were stressing out and harassing him online. So he's like, fine, I'm leaving, okay? Happy. But if he had an 18-year term, he wouldn't have to worry about it. Even Justice Roberts, way back before he became a judge, was kind of like, hey, this will be good, it's a great idea. Of course, this is back in 1983 when he was just a young lawyer, and I'm not sure anyone's asked him whether he feels the same today. Okay. So, and the public generally supports term limits. So some people have been polled on this. I think 63%, around 60% is about the numbers. And although Democrats, not surprisingly, support this more than Republicans do, clear majorities of both parties and independents do support this idea. So this is not just a sore loser phenomenon, like I'm a Democrat, I hate the Supreme Court, I want new rules. I think everyone who's thought about this thinks this could be kind of a good, reasonable approach to make the court a little better. One of the things that actually I also think would help is that the proposal by Senators Manchin and Welch would fix the size of the court at 9. Right now, in theory, Congress could, so-called pack the court by adding justices, which they over the years has threatened to do, and which is currently being thought about. But that's more destabilizing than putting terms on. So one trade would be, okay, we agree that we'll only have 9, you can't just add justices, but everyone gets 2 appointments during your presidential term. So just to sum up, I think that the benefits outweigh the costs or the objections. The one thing I'll just mention on the objections is that there is the argument that we lose experience. And as when I was younger, I would have said, wow, 18 years, that's a long time. But I've actually now been doing the same job for like 25 years, it feels like, and I feel like that's not long enough still. And I would hate for someone to say get out. But having said that, I'm not sure that's the same for judges. 18 years is a long time for judges, and I think you don't lose a lot of experience. And there's also the downside. 18 years is great, and no disrespect, but maybe 40 years. After 40 years, maybe there's something else you could do. Right? There's plenty of stuff to do. I think you could be something else besides Supreme Court justice. But that is something concerned. There's also concern that justices, knowing that they are leaving the end of their term, are going to game the system and try to get a fancy job after they leave. But justices can retire anyways at any time, and have retired and taken lucrative positions doing cool stuff that's a little sketchy. So that's totally within our tradition as well. So in general, this is, despite my general suspicion of dramatic changes, I think this is one I can get behind, and I think, but I'd be curious to see how the views of this group, what the views of this group are. Okay, so with that, we're going to run an experiment with technology here. It's always dangerous, which of course I don't like, because as you know, I don't like new things. But all right, so let's try this. So please take a few minutes to scan this QR code if you have a phone. If you don't have a phone, what century are you living in? And this should give you, if it works properly, a poll, which gives you 3 questions that you have to answer. One is whether or not we should have, whether you support, and this conversation has convinced you that we need some sort of wholesale, dramatic constitutional change. And then second, we asked you to rank the 3 proposals that you heard here from the panelists. And then third, I just added, just for fun, random proposals that are currently in Congress for amending the Constitution, whether there's any of them you would actually support. So what I'd like to do then is, actually, I should probably do this as well. And then I'd like you to take a few minutes to vote, and then I'll sort of show the results. But now that I think about it, I need to do this. Are people able to get into the oh, okay. 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 Oh, I couldn't. Sorry to turn screen. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So just give it a shot. I know this is a little bit annoying, but it's kind of. I'm curious to see what people think. Okay. All right. I actually need now to log out in order to actually show you the results. So just bear with me for a second. Has anyone got a chance to log in? I'm going to take the code down for a second.
Julia, are you checking your phone? Yo, fucking outrageous. Outrageous, bro. Outrageous, outrageous, outrageous. What did you just say?
I think I have figured out how to show this, so let's see if I can do this. Okay. Alright, so do we need a wholesale constitutional change? I knew I shouldn't have given you guys a maybe option. So I don't know if you guys can see this. Okay. So the yeses are 54, nos are 65. Maybes are 59s. I really should have just picked. Okay. Rank the areas of constitutional change discussed in order of urgency to you. Alright, interesting. So, term limits and gerrymandering reform. I spelled gerrymandering wrong, but no one really knows how to spell it. Okay. Okay, and then the last one. Okay, interesting. These are things I just pulled up random things that have been introduced in the last Congress for constitutional amendments. You have no idea how often constitutional amendments are introduced in Congress and ignored. But anyways, so interesting that we have term limits seems to have the most support, limits on executive privilege, second, and limiting campaign contributions, third. Okay, that's very interesting. So thank you for sharing those results. I don't know if you guys can see, it's a little small, I guess, but I can't zoom in anymore on this. So all right, so that's sort of, I think we sort of showed some, at least we haven't really made the case that we desperately need constitutional reform, but at least we have some sort of people who think out there. So let's just, what we want to do for the rest of the period then, is sort of open it up to questions. Or if you have actually, if you're one of my students and if you have actually your constitutional reform that you'd like to propose that we haven't discussed, feel free to raise it. We have microphones, so if you please, Professor Deane Roberts will sort of moderate. If you have questions for us or ideas, please raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you.
Yeah, so, I guess my question is, because this is just being presented as like a solution to the, shall we call it, political turmoil and the gridlock and everything. When I think of this, I'm like, I get the feeling it would make things worse, right? I mean, we as a country were so divided, and while, nobody is gonna, take up arms over the tax rate. Well, I mean, we did, but, no, but, like, why would we think that we could get this done and that we could come to consensus when we're so divided on all these issues? Because inevitably, we talk about constitutional reform, people are gonna bring up, all right, well, what about, clarifying, privacy rights? What about, codifying same-sex marriage? What about this? What about that? What about getting rid of the Second Amendment or reforming it? We're going to open up all these cans of worms when we talk about. I don't think that we're in the place, in the right place for this. I mean.
That actually raises two legal questions. One is that actually a number of the things we're talking about could be done by statute if the polity got together behind it. And the other one is if the constitutional conventions, not the proposal for a single amendment coming through Congress, but the other way that states call for a constitutional convention, can be limited to a single issue. And that is an unresolved legal question for the very good reason it's never happened. In principle, you could call, the requisite number of states could call for a constitutional convention to consider repeal of the Second Amendment, period. And then the only question would be when they all showed up, whether they would be limited by that call for a convention or could propose all these other things. But presumably, all these other things would be unlikely to get ratified because the outraged voters who had called for a convention to talk about the Second Amendment would be unhappy with the But the answer is there are solutions to those good problems being raised.
I think it's a very fair point that it's difficult to do this and it's hard to see how you would have a consensus that could prove more decisive. But we're celebrating the semi-centennial of the Declaration of Independence next year, right? It's to another add, so 250 years of the Declaration, add another, it's back 11 years, the Constitution was erected. It won't be easy to do, and I'm not sure that we would see a convention in the next 5 years, maybe in the next 10, I don't know. But I think it's important to have that conversation, because if people are unhappy with the state of American politics overall, I don't know that it's enough to just keep working within the system that we have, even if we don't get to those changes. And I agree that if we have a constitutional convention, you don't know what else, that's what happens in the 1780 statute, probably. It's supposed to revise our Declaration. But I think we've had enough kind of crisis points in the last 2 decades that it's important for us to, that it's important for us to consider the possibility of changing the Constitution.
Everybody else.
Okay. This is actually for my former professor, Professor Friedman. With your proposed plan, how do you reconcile the current tension we already see between the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, and the 14th Amendment in the way you would draw your maps in the nonpartisan system? How do you account for that? Or would it just be that perhaps in the perfect world we wouldn't draw districts based on race, but does your system allow for that? Or like what would be the counter to that problem? Why we have the Voting Rights Act?
That, again, sorry, there are several questions contained in there too, right? One is, remember the block. Okay. All of the progress towards the first set of maps, which has brought us to the extremism today, has been due to an interpretation of the Voting Rights Act, that section called no retrogression. No retrogression means that when states submitted plans, all of which is now have ancient history in light of the invalidation of pre-clearance, but when states submitted plans and by statute had to show that there would be no retrogression in the opportunity of minority groups to be heard, you got number one. That was defined as we're going to have minority group as our concept. Didn't have to be, but it's on number two. No retrogression in our ability to be heard. For a political scientist would have gone with law number two. Right? The second thing is that there are many other things that didn't get to, one of which would be multi-member districts. Suppose Pennsylvania has 20 representatives. You split Pennsylvania halfway east to west by population. That'll mean mostly Republicans in the west and mostly Democrats in the east. And there's no individual districts, there's no gerrymandering, and there's a much better chance for a Socialist Party candidate or a Green Party to get into the top 10. But the reason those systems, which existed at various times in American history, were downplayed was because it's a problem for racial minorities as opposed to drawing districts with that consideration in mind. But we can solve that with the voting rules. If the reason it's subordinate minority interests is everybody has one vote, and you pick one of the 10. But suppose I gave you 10 votes, and you can divide them as you like, spread them on your top 3 candidates, use them all on a single candidate. That helps cohesive minorities of any sort, whether they're racial, environmentalists, or whatever. And in fact, many New York City co-ops have that form of voting for the reason that because lots of people in non-eviction plans, aging demographic now, who bought their apartments very cheap and are, relatively speaking, older and poorer, have an interest in keeping maintenance charges down as opposed to investing in upgrading the building and making it more attractive to interact. Okay, those people are almost always going to get one seat on the board if we create this voting thing. So the short answer is, yeah, there are ways to both solve our gerrymandering problem and take racial minority concerns into account.
Anyone else on that? Questions?
My question is regarding additions to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court today is the only real branch preventing us from having a single branch government, as we've seen a lot of compliance with Congress to allow the executive branch to run without checks and balances. Along with that, the court's supposed to be the most powerful and most limited with its power, actually the weakest according to the Constitution. So my question is, why should we weaken the power of the only branch that's stopping us from becoming a unitary executive government?
Okay. No, that's a fair point. And I think what this raises the broader question of, can you really just do piecemeal constitutional reform? For instance, if you change the court, should you also do something to help strengthen Congress or fix Congress? Or, this goes to the idea maybe we need like more than one change, right? Because I think if the court is weakened somehow, then that would be a problem if we don't fix the other problems that exist. My thought on this is actually, I'm not sure if my proposal for term limits would weaken the court, especially since it would take a long time for it to be implemented, I think. I think it would sort of regularize what's already happening, right? So in the current court, I think it's fair to say you're right, is the courts themselves are the primary check on the President Trump in his first year. But Congress could be a check, and if the election could be a check, with the change election. And the court, right now, you lock into place the current court, you might get sort of results that also might be not be sort of friendly to the president as well. So I think if we have term limits, I'm not sure we can be confident which way it goes. It might strengthen the court, because the other thing it might do is strengthen the legitimacy of the court, which is weakening, I think. People generally, polls show, are dissatisfied with the Supreme Court more than they have been in the past. And one of the reasons is because people are so fired up about each nominee and go, get really excited and go crazy over if they don't get the nominee they want. So this process, I think, might sort of take the temperature down, and it's because of what happens over a long period of time, would allow the court to slowly sort of build its political strength over time. So that's my theory. But I hear your point that it's almost like if you have a big machine and you only fix one part of the machine and you don't fix the other parts, that could be a problem. That's a challenge to those who want to change just one part of the Constitution.
We have one other question, and while the mic's going to, I'm going to go a little off script and ask you a slightly different question, which is, given what we heard from all of you and from some of the questions about sort of dysfunction at the federal level, and Professor Bose talked about sort of some of the federalism issues. What about just sort of thinking of the idea of rights and the will of the people kind of devolving down to the state and even municipal level, and sort of, which we sort of have right now in some ways, and kind of walking away from reform at the federal level and focusing, there are some calls to focus down for change. What do the panelists think about that?
The panelists think that those people currently teaching constitutional law are really going to have to scrap their course in order to make that happen, right? Because the judicial interpretations of the legislative powers of Congress are very extensive, including, of course, the supremacy clause, Article 6, which outright says in principal language that federal statutes. And so, talk about an idea which has the all force of incumbency against it, right? Congress is not going to sit idly by, and has not been sitting idly by under successive administrations when things being implemented at the state level, whether it has to do with liability insurance rules for rental car companies or open carry, are such as to violate the policy preferences of Congress. So I think for that to happen, you would have to have such a major reform that you'd be running into the risks of all the problems that got us. Because the original reform that is the United States.
Is it good? Let's just go down the line.
think there's been a lot of movement in the past decade for civic engagement at the state and local levels. And indeed, when we're looking at 2028 presidential contenders, a lot of governors, at least with the Democrats, right, since the Republican Party, the vice president is the obvious, it seems like the obvious candidate at this time. But I would say that there are limits on what can be done with federalism. The laboratories of democracy mean that just who gets what because of who gets where, and for issues such as immigration, for example, very confusing and very problematic to have a lack of national action, and Congress really has not done any control in 30 years. Such
Yeah, so I'm actually probably the most sort of states' rights of the group here. So I'm generally in favor of giving more autonomy to the states. I think, but I agree that there are lots of problems doing that. But I do think that one thing we've learned in the last, say, 10 years, I think, is that the states, some states can, especially since Dobbs, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, states can vary pretty dramatically in their preferences for rights. And so some states can protect rights in a way that is very different than other states, and that might reflect the policy preferences of those groups, and they can provide the types of protections that the federal government would never be able, there'd never be enough national consensus to do so. So I do think that, and one thing I think also might be a virtue of the last couple presidencies, I suppose, is that it used to be that historically Democrats were the big federal government. More federal government, better federal government, more Supreme Court, better Supreme Court, more federal, more national rights. And I think the Democrats are learning some of the benefits of states' rights in the current moment. And that, for instance, New York State could pass an amendment to the New York State Constitution just this past November, which really provided really dramatically new protection or enhanced protections for equal rights and rights beyond, which way beyond what they could ever get at the federal level. And that the states do have a lot of autonomy, and it's good that they do. And and the same thing with the fight over immigration, that the states have shown that through state action, state legislative action, you can do things and get things done, for instance, on these referendums protecting abortion, in states that you might have imagined were pro-life, like Kansas, right? The people really wanted to protect abortion, they did, Michigan, and so they got, in some ways, more protection they might have otherwise gotten under the federal system. So I think there is some benefit to the federal system that both parties, I think, are going to recognize, and the Republicans will rediscover this once they lose power.
Yes, I would just say that in my lifetime, the first person to make this argument, coming out of the civil rights era when states' rights meant segregation, was Justice Brennan, who in a path-breaking law review article, seeing conservative trends ahead, wrote an article that said what Professor Cooper just said.
And that's the article I was thinking of and asked the question. We have time for one last question. If there was one after.
I think it's more of a comment. I think I've been convinced by this panel that you can change the Constitution, you can change the rules, but there are such limitations to that. We haven't said anything about norms. The norm of a peaceful transition of power, for instance, who would ever have thought that legislatures could appoint electors who were not elected when that's required by law? I think that's the danger of making too much change in the Constitution, that you can work around changes in the rules, and that's the norm has been to do that in our opinion. But we really need to attack the norms.
John Adams said, the people of Massachusetts can make any constitution work, meaning the people of Massachusetts understand what is meant by a representative government, and it doesn't matter what the parliament says. And of course, relatively, the parchment, as in many countries, can say all kinds of great stuff, and that doesn't mean it's going to happen. Of course, whether it happens depends on the hearts and minds of the people. All of us theoretical constitutional style effect.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think, you know, as a lawyer, I'm always a little more so skeptical but nervous when I talk about norms because, you know, it does seem very unlaw-like. But I do agree that they're very important. I'm just a little nervous about relying upon norms. I think, but I do think one thing I will just say is I took away from this, think about this. I've always been worried about the idea of the heroic judge, the judges as heroes that will come save. Imagine the 9 Supreme Court justices as sort of Marvel superheroes, the Avengers, right? That they will just come solve our problems. If we just get the right Avengers in there, right? This is a superhero disease that America is suffering under these movies, right? So, you know, that this is not the way to solve America's problems, to wait for 9 geniuses to be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court or elect the right president who is like a nice person. You know, or whatever it is. I think we do need. I think the problem with this is that people have become a little passive. I think, in thinking that and this is why that we're a little like we can't do anything. You know, I can't do anything. I'm just gonna go off and do something else because I can't change anything. And I think that's part of the problem that we're facing. And maybe I think if we think less about you know finding heroes to save us, and maybe thinking more about what we can do as sort of individuals or smaller groups or community groups and such, that can make a difference in ways that we maybe don't always appreciate.
I would just say, I think that could be an entire separate panel on norms versus rules, and it's an important one. The framers did emphasize norms. Federalist 70 talks about energy in the executive and says the check of the president is a defense of people and a due responsibility. And I don't think we're talking about the national character of the Senate. If elected officials are not meeting those standards, then it becomes very difficult to see how you legislate change. But I think just as you're talking about groups of people coming together, groups of
Let's take Front Street
and
Southern State Parkway West, Parkway West.
That's a good line to end on. So let's thank the panelists and